My study was on sports injury prevention and reduction through educating student athletes and parent guardians. The Institute of Medicine has raised concerns about the lack of support to advance injury prevention and control, believing that by providing supports and programs will include all stakeholders in the fight against sports injuries to student athletes. A few problems are that adolescent sports injury has become a prevalent public health issue, and that sports injury can cause short and long-term damage for student athletes. The ultimate goal of my research was to examine the need for education addressing sports injury prevention and reduction provided to the student athlete and the parent guardian of the student athlete, specifically those student athletes involved in girls and boys varsity soccer programs throughout AA public high schools in Montana. This was a quantitative research study, and it investigated the relationship, if any, between the amount of time spent educating student athletes and the parent guardians of those student athletes on prevention of sports injuries and the number of injuries that occur throughout the season. So with that, then the research question is there a relationship between the number of hours spent educating the student athlete and the parent guardian of that student athlete on prevention of sports injuries and the number of injuries experienced by the student athlete throughout the season? There were a few significances to this study. It could guide schools in the type of education that they provide student athletes and parent guardians of the student athletes and help in the decision making of what programs and education we provide. It could also show the importance to stakeholders that it is a shared responsibility to fight in this public health issue against sports injuries. And it could also provide a justification to build a culture that promotes student athletes' well-being, not only academically and behaviorally, but also the health of the student athlete. There were 4 terms that I felt that needed to be defined. The first one being student athlete. For the purposes of this study, the student athlete is a student who is enrolled and attends high school and also participates on an organized high school athletic team or in an individual competition. Also for the purpose of this study, the athletic event will be female and male varsity soccer. The second term is the parent guardian. For the purpose of this study, the parent guardian goes beyond the father and the mother. It also includes the guardian of the student, who is one that protects and watches over the student athlete and is legally responsible for the care and management of the student athlete. The third is injury prevention education. For the purpose of this study, this is the number of hours of training and information dispersed through teaching information related to sports injury. This will include risk factors, injury assessment, an action plan, emergency plan, and prevention methods, aimed to reduce and prevent injuries dispersed prior to season starting. And the fourth is sports injury. A sports injury is harm or damage that occurs, 1, as a result of participation in an organized high school competition or practice, 2, requires medical attention from someone trained in the particular injury, and 3, restriction and or modification of student athletes' participation for 1 or more days. The review of the literature. For the purpose of this study, I looked at a few different pieces of literature, but the one that I found to be the most beneficial was the relationship between high school coaches' beliefs and sports injury and prevention practice and readiness, focusing on what the coach does and their education and how they treat and ready themselves to then educate their student athletes. This was a dissertation by Siwan Zheng, and it was published in 2013. It was a mixed method study, a qualitative and quantitative study. It looked at the adolescent sports injury and how this was a prevalent public health issue. This study looked at how important the coach is in preventing and reducing injuries, and looks at the level of competency and how this affects beliefs, practices, and readiness. This study looked at 3 different questions. The 3 questions were, 1, what are the coach's beliefs and knowledge related to sports injury and their readiness for injury prevention practices? 2, what are relationships between coaches' beliefs and knowledge pertaining to sports injury and readiness injury prevention practices? And 3, what are the differences in coach-related factors between the coaches who have medical staff and those who do not? The finding in this study was that it demonstrated the importance of educating adults in contact with student athletes and the student athletes themselves. So this was anyone that was in contact, specifically looking at the coach. It also showed that as you build the education, you build the competency. And as you build competency, then that starts to change the belief and the belief set and the practices of a certain individual. So as the coach's education increased, their belief about how important sports injury prevention was increased as well. And their practices also started to become along those lines of implementing education for their student athletes and making sure that they either had a medical staff on or someone that they could contract during games and to come in and give seminars as well. It also showed through the findings that it is important, there was a statistical significance to give coaches the tools to deal with prevention and reduction. And this had a direct correlation with the belief set of and practices that went throughout the season. So my methodology of my study, it was a quantitative correlation that was conducted to analyze and consider the relationship, if any, between the number of hours spent educating student athletes and the parent guardians of those student athletes on prevention and reduction injury, and the number of injuries the student athlete endured throughout the season. My hypothesis was there will be a relationship between the number of hours spent educating the student athletes and the parent guardians and the number of injuries the student athlete endures throughout the season. For my population, I looked at all 14 AA Montana public high schools in Montana. I also looked at the female and male varsity soccer players within each one of those programs. Altogether, there were 560 student athletes in the female and male varsity soccer programs. My sample size was a 229 computer-generated random sample through the RAOSOF program. For the purpose of this paper and the data collection, because this was a fictitious study, I decided to use a sample of 31, and you'll see that in my raw data collection. My independent and dependent variable. My independent variable was the amount of time spent educating the student athlete and the parent guardian. The dependent variable was the number of injuries that student athlete received or endured throughout the soccer season. I also looked at the ratio level of measurement. So the data collection, the way I went about doing this is there was education that was dispersed at the beginning of the season. This was given to the randomly selected student athletes and their parents. Each student athlete was given a number and recorded to that number 1 through 31 for this study, but it would have been 1 through 20 or 229 for the real study. These sessions were face-to-face sessions, webinars, as well as online tutorials to get to everyone and be able to disperse the education properly. The hours of education varied to the student athlete and their parent guardian. They went from 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10 hours of education. This was also entered into the Excel spreadsheet. So you have the number that was correlated, or that went with the student athlete's name, and then you also had the amount of hours entered into the raw data. There was a survey then given out at the end of the season. This was given through the coaches, and the coaches were able to give these to their student athletes that were chosen randomly, and to the parent, or the student athlete in particular. These were given at the celebrations at the end of the season, or at the last game, last practice, however they thought this could get to each one of the randomly selected student athletes. And then once I got, and I'll show the survey, or the information in the survey in a moment, but once I got the survey back, then this information was entered into the data sheet of the spreadsheet of how many injuries were endured. So this survey included the name of the student athlete, the school they attended, the gender, which would show whether they were on the female or male varsity soccer team, and then as well as the number of injuries and a thorough explanation of the injury itself. So we could understand if there was medical attention, how many days they were out, so on and so forth. My data analysis. This was a regression analysis using the Pearson-R correlation to determine the degree of relationship. So it was a statistical analysis. My null hypothesis was there will be no experimental importance or consistent relationship between the number of hours spent educating the student athlete and the parent guardian of those student athletes on the prevention of sports injury and the number of injuries that occurred throughout the season. The experimental importance, R value, was set at 0.7 with the consistency set at least 0.49 and experimental consistency alpha level at 0.05. A priori assumption was that there was a normality met through a sufficient sample size, randomly selected, and the level of data was ratio. My findings. When we look at the raw data, we'll look at the hours of education spent in a variety of hours. As you can see here, we have the numbers that were assigned to the student athlete as an ID number. We have the number of hours spanning anywhere from 2, 4, 6, 8, or 10, and then the number of injuries. So when we looked at the mean was 5.94 hours of education and 1.87 injuries that occurred. When we looked at the variance and the standard deviation, the variance was 8.40 hours of education from the mean and then 1.78 injuries. And the standard deviation was 2.85 hours of education and 1.34. This calculates the spread of how far each individual point is away from the mean, and conceptually, for the purpose of this research, the standard deviation is conceptually relevant since the values are calculated in the same units and are not squared. The Pearson R value, which we'll look at in the scatter plot, was negative 0.743, showing a negative correlation in the relationship, and the coefficient of determinant was set at 55%. So when we look at the determination of the null hypothesis, the null hypothesis was rejected. When we look at the Pearson R value met negative 0.743, this met the level of experimental importance at 0.70, which also, as I already mentioned, showed that negative correlation relationship. So as the number of hours of education increased, the fewer injuries should have been occurring throughout the season. The experimental consistency was critical at 0.349, thus meeting the level set, the alpha level set at 0.05. The p-value was also calculated through GB Stats program at 0.001, which then the p-value definitely met. So therefore, showing that there was a statistical and practical significance to this study. Here we see that negative correlation. So the number of hours of education are at the bottom. As the number of hours of education increased, the number of injuries decreased, and we see that that's a pretty strong, significant correlation. Recommendations. I do recommend that all female and male student athletes and parent guardians of those student athletes should receive sports injury prevention and reduction education prior to the season. This could be in face-to-face format, it could also be webinars, and it also could be online tutorials. But with this study, there are implications for further research, and I found a few to be important. One being a study on whether it is necessary to educate the student athlete as well as the parent guardian, or is it just sufficient to educate the student athlete? And what is the sufficient amount of hours needed to educate the student athlete, and if the parent guardian is necessary, so that there is a significant difference in sports injuries. Another study could look at the components that are necessary in the training. and what components are necessary that we see this correlation where injuries are prevalent or are fewer throughout the season. Another study could look at which sports and the different types of sports. So we looked at soccer, but looking at, does this education significantly decrease the amount of injuries that happen in different sports like football and volleyball, softball, looking at those different sports, basketball. And then also, if it is statistically significant in the other sports, to educate the student athlete and parent guardian if need be, what are the different types of components for each different sport that might be necessary, and do they differ gender to gender? So this was my fictitious study, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.